Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 2021 OHS conference. I'm so excited to see everyone. My name is Shelby Ward, and I'm here to talk about something that I'm very excited about, Uncle Wallace and Aunt Minerva. I will be referring to them as Wallace and Minerva during this presentation. Some of you may be very familiar with their story. Some of you may be hearing about their story for the first time. So I will be talking about their musical lives, but I will also focus on a genealogy between them and then also within their family. I'm a genealogist, so I'm approaching this topic from a genealogical perspective. And I will have story, but I will also have a little methods here so folks may be able to glean some insights if you're also interested in researching enslaved folks within Indian Territory and their descendants. So with that, my talk, The Misremembered, Uncle Wallace and Aunt Minerva, Establishing Father-Daughter Kinship. So my connection with this story or this research is actually many generations long. I'm a descendant of Wallace Willis. So I learned about him as a child from my mom telling stories. My mom's a natural storyteller. And on this slide, I have some family photos from the past. I have an old photo from earlier in the 20th century on the right. And then on the upper left, there's a group family photo. I'm the little girl in the middle. And that was taken in 1989. And then below that, I have a picture of my mom with her two brothers and my big brother from the 80s. So this is personal for me in terms of the story, but it's also something that is very interesting to me from a history perspective. I have a bachelor's degree in history. So this is my hobby. It's fun doing history and genealogy. So my outline, I have three main parts to the presentation. The first part is a simple background information. Who are Wallace and Minerva? So I'll talk about music a little bit. Secondly, how are they related? So this is the bulk of my presentation where I will talk about the sources that I've looked at, where I got them from, and how those sources give me insights about relationships. And then third, why does this matter? Why are we talking about this at a conference dedicated to perspectives and history and genealogy? So I will share some big picture ideas that I've gleaned from getting these insights and the significance in terms of how I think we need to reframe the discussion, particularly with these two characters. And in terms of how I share history, there's all kinds of details. So right now I want to give you the main points so we don't get them lost. So number one, Wallace and Minerva were these musical creatives that made an impact here in Oklahoma and then also beyond because of how music was shared to their parent and child. And that's something that's contrary to public history. And I'll talk about how that is in fact the case based upon the sources that I uncovered and how they corroborate that conclusion there. And then three, why does this matter? Understanding their relationship helps us move from caricatures to actual persons. And so giving a greater sense of humanity to who they were in the art that they created. So first, who are Wallace and Minerva? They're musical artists. And with this story, some folks are very familiar with it, but for those that aren't, I'll share a little bit. So with Wallace and Minerva, they created and performed Negro spirituals during the antebellum period in Indian Territory before the Civil War. And they were in the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, and they were singing songs at potentially several places, one of them being Spencer Academy. And a man by the name of Alexander Reed was the superintendent there, and he documented these songs, shared them with the Fisk Jubilee Singers, which is a story in and of itself. And the Fisk Jubilee Singers went on a tour nationally, internationally, became this incredible music sensation. And so they popularized Negro spirituals and Black music and set the stage for the proliferation of Black art after in terms of musical form. And Wallace and Minerva were part of that story by having some of these songs. And coming back to Oklahoma in terms of how that was memorialized, the state of Oklahoma designated a song credited to them as the state gospel song in 2011, and Wallace was inducted into the Oklahoma Jazz Hall of Fame in 2010. So Oklahoma has remembered this musical part of their story and has honored them in such a way. But there's more to the story here. That's why I'm here. Looking at the genealogy of these folks, Wallace and Minerva were real people in real time. And as folks that lived in the Choctaw and Chickasaw nations as enslaved persons, their descendants ended up on the freedmen sections of the Dawes Rolls in the late 19th, early 20th century. And so for folks that aren't familiar with the Dawes Rolls, before Oklahoma became a state in 1907, you had allotment of lands that belonged to the tribes. And so people that were members of tribal communities received allotments. And in that process, you had lots of paperwork generated. And so you had Dawes cards that described where people lived and their family relationships. And so where I'm coming in, I'm a descendant of Wallace Willis, and I'm looking at my mother's life, my grandparents' lives, their parents' lives, etc. And so I come to the life of a woman named Charity Williams. And Charity Williams is a daughter of Wallace Willis, and this is her Dawes card. And with the freedmen, there's a front of the card and the back of the card. And so on the front of the card, okay, I'm seeing information about her life. I flip the card over. On the back, I see information about her father, Wallace Willis. But then in the column where it says name of the mother, I see the name Charlotte Willis. And so Charlotte, who is that? That's not Minerva. And earlier in my journey, before I figure all this stuff out, I don't even see a Minerva. So when I'm looking at the popular history of this couple, Wallace and Minerva, Aunt Minerva, Uncle Wallace, they're a couple, old Negro couples singing songs together. I'm like, that's not in the genealogy. There's this inconsistency. So my questions, who is Charlotte, the woman on the Dawes card who's supposed to be the co-parent with Wallace for this child, Charity? And then are Wallace and Minerva really a couple? And as I told you before, they're not really a couple, but at the time I don't know this. So I am on this journey. I'm, trying to figure things out, and I start examining sources. And so for me, there are three sources that I want to share with you beyond the Dawes cards that present a genealogy. So they're sources in themselves, but I'm looking at three other sets that are, speaking to these questions. What's the kinship between Wallace and Minerva? So that's me in the library, reading, discovering, and I think this might be the first one, or maybe I had another one, but these illustrations, the black and whites, I had an artist commission them because I'm writing this project up in a manuscript, and I also have illustrations. So this is one of the illustrations he did for me. So who are they? They're parent and child, Wallace and Minerva. So one document that I look at is a letter from Alexander Reed. So remember, Alexander was the superintendent of Spencer Academy who knew Wallace and Minerva because they were hired out to work there. And I wanted to look at this letter because the book, Oklahoma, A History of the State and Its People, Volume 2, references it. So some people might have been familiar with this document. And he's somebody that knew Wallace and Minerva. And so I'm asking myself, okay, did he ever allege that they were a couple? What did Alex say in this document? And so this was a letter that he wrote to John Edwards, who's another missionary or leader in the Presbyterian Church in 1884. And in the letter, he talks about how he came to document the stories and, his stories with the Jubilee Singers and everything. So there are many parts of this letter, but this is one excerpt. And this was actually a reprinted version from the Presbyterian, because when Reed died, the Presbyterian newspaper, which is a periodical of the Presbyterian Church, republished it in 1890. So here's one portion of the letter. So he writes this: if Uncle Wallace had a grandson or granddaughter really worth sending to Fisk, I believe they would be received there and educated gratuitously for his sake and Aunt Minerva's sake, for whom I learned Steal the Way to Jesus. So I love this excerpt because he mentions that he learned Steal the Way to Jesus from Aunt Minerva or Minerva. And he mentions them, but notice how he doesn't mention them together, but separately. And so for each of these instances in the letter, they're mentioned singularly. So it's not Wallace and Minerva's grandchildren. And I know it's like a little detail, but when you're reading, you have to think about what's said and what's not said. And so as I mentioned, Alex mentions Wallace in these singular ways, and nowhere in the letter does he allege that Wallace and Minerva are a couple. So when I'm reading this, I'm like, okay, I can do some more digging. This is not like the direct evidence, the smoking gun, that they're really a couple or something like that. And like the Dawes records are wrong. So I keep looking. And so where I go to Chickasaw territory, I should say old Chickasaw territory, and what we call present day Mississippi before removal. So Wallace and Minerva were removed in 1842. So they left on the during Indian removal during that period. But before then, they lived in Marshall County, not Oklahoma, Marshall County, Mississippi. Let me do my little dot right there. And Holly Springs is a city in that county. And in their case, here in this county, I find a probate file of a prior owner. And for folks that are doing research of enslaved folks, probate files have amazing information when you're dealing with owners or people that are connected with owners, because enslaved people are mentioned by name and they have information so you can get genealogical information. So prior to May 1840, there's a man by the name of John B. Moore that owns Wallace and Minerva. And he has a will that he wrote in 1839, and he died the next year. And so I'm able to see the will and then the probate of the will. And these different events have documents that are generated that it's telling me information about Wallace and Minerva and the people around them. And for these documents, I will have the transcription on my slide, but then I'll show you a picture or a copy of the document so you can see what it looks like, because it's like cursive writing and everything. So in this will from one of their prior owners, it says this. So John Moore bequests, quote, Wallace, Charlotte, Joe, Minerva, Jane, and Jack, and their increase, unquote, to Colbert Moore for the benefit of John's daughter, Harriet Moore Mosley. So you see this cluster here of persons. First, Wallace, so our Wallace Willis, the musical guy. Charlotte, and remember there's a Charlotte from the Dawes card who's allegedly the mother of one of his children, some other people, and also a Minerva. So this is a picture of the will, and this is a copy that's in the probate book in Marshall County, and I got this from Family Search. And I boxed in the clause that mentions them. So this fourth clause is the clause that relates to his daughter, Harriet, because John had several daughters and several sons. And so in this one, this is where you have Wallace, Charlotte, Minerva, and others mentioned. And they're right there. I put it in yellow so you can see it. So Wallace, Charlotte, Joe, Minerva, Jane, and Jack in their increase. Okay. Now, that's just the will. And as I said before, the probate file has other information. So the will is presented, and then later they have to do an inventory of all of the property, because when people die, sometimes debts are owed. And so you have to know how much money somebody has, right? And so you have an estate appraisal that's done in November of 1840. And in this appraisal, you have all the property, including the enslaved persons. And you have their names, you have their approximate ages, and their appraised value. And so here we're able to get more information about that cluster that was shared in the will. So in the appraisal, we have more information. We have Wallace, Charlotte, and now we have a daughter, Charity. So remember Charity, Joe, and Minerva. And so with this, Wallace is 38. Charlotte, the woman mentioned right next to him in the will, is 35. And then the daughter, the child, Charity, is 1 year old. And then you have Joe, 9. And then the Minerva that is mentioned is 2 years old. So this is consistent with the idea of Wallace and Minerva not being a couple because of the age difference. And then also Wallace and Charlotte being a couple because their ages are very similar. And see here that Charlotte just recently had a child because she had a child sometime between when the will was written and here when you have the appraisal. And so this is the copy of the actual appraisal in the probate book. And you have many people listed here, and I'll highlight the folks that are the subject of our presentation. So Wallace, about 35 years old, and his appraised value, $500. Underneath him directly, Charlotte, 35, and her child, Charity, 1 year old, $450. Joe, 9, $350, and then Minerva, 2 years old. And then the other two children that were mentioned in the cluster, they're elsewhere in the document. So all of this that I'm seeing here is giving me evidence. So ages of the enslaved persons in the inventory, it suggests that Wallace and Minerva aren't a couple because of the age gap, that it's not there. And then also the cluster pattern suggests that Minerva and Wallace are not a couple. And I didn't get into the details here, but if people are curious in the Q&A, as I said before, the owner had many children. And so for each of those bequests, the pattern that you saw was the first two people were usually a man and a woman of a similar age that could have more children. And so John was thinking about giving his children, like he was having an equitable division of property, right? So you had like couples that could have more children so the, slave holding can increase among his children. And so that suggests to me that Wallace and Charlotte were a couple, right? But here, I still don't have, the direct in black and white. And sometimes this is as good as it gets for genealogists, but I still keep digging. I want to know more. I want to see if I could find something that says that, this is the Minerva that I'm looking for. This is the Wallace, even though I have other things lined up. So I go to Fisk University. I go to their library, the John Hope and Aurelia Franklin library on campus in Nashville. And this was before Corona happened. So I got to, be there in person. I should say the coronavirus rather. They have an incredible staff, incredible library, special collections. So I went in there and I looked at their various collections about the Jubilee Singers. I didn't find anything directly on point to this question, but I was talking to their director of special collections, Miss Harris, and she was like, I need to show you something. Let me hand you something. And she gave me a document. This document was a column from the Fisk Herald, which was a periodical on campus that the students published. And in this issue, there was a column from our guy again, Alex Reed, missionary superintendent of Spencer Academy. And it was called Sketch of the Life of Uncle Wallace, from whom came the Jubilee song, Steal Away to Jesus. And he wrote this in 1884 after Wallace Willis died. So he wrote an obituary. Alex Reed wrote an obituary, put it in the Fisk University newspaper. And this was a diamond. It had so much information about Wallace's life. And Reed begins this obituary column with this line: Wallace Burton was born in 1802 near Charleston, South Carolina. And he goes on and he talks about how he, was traded into northern Mississippi. And let me go to the next part. So this is like the top part of the column here. And he mentions this when Wallace was in Mississippi. Here, he found his wife, Charlotte, the mother of his two daughters, Minerva and Charity. So that's it right there in black and white, what I was looking for. And I was completely floored because as people that do genealogy know, you don't always find direct evidence, but it's right here. It's from a known source. This is Alexander Reed himself, somebody that knows Wallace and Minerva. We know that he knows them, and he authored another key letter. And so interpreting them together, you can see how it all, comes full circle. And he goes on in this obituary column. He mentions former owners. He mentions the move to Boggy Depot. He mentions church membership information. Of course, that's what he keeps track of. He's a missionary. He even mentions when Charlotte, his wife, dies. She predeceases Wallace by about 10 years. And he provides extensive detail about the daughter. So about Charity. And remember, we saw Charity's DOS card at the very beginning of this presentation, and she was also mentioned as a baby in the probate file. And then, of course, Minerva and their children. So this is just an incredible piece of information. And this is another excerpt here. So, and in this column, he gives like this account of like the days leading up to Wallace's death and how he dies and everything. And so right here, he writes, on Monday morning, he took hold of Aunt Minerva's hand and said, "My daughter, it will be but a little while, and I shall be in bright glory land. And here, Wallace is referring to a song, and it's just great because Alex mentioned some other songs that Wallace loves that are important to him. But I love it because Wallace purportedly says, my daughter, directly to Minerva, and her title is used. So Aunt Minerva, even though you have like this father-daughter interaction, that title is used. So this obituary corroborates other sources, to paint the picture that Wallace and Minerva are parent and child. And it provides direct evidence of a father-daughter kinship because Reed knew them directly. This is happening, at a time. So this is not someone later that's getting information secondhand or after the fact. And I would also say it provides insight on how the title that was used, or titles, because the title of the column says Uncle Wallace, and then within the body, Aunt Minerva is referred to as Aunt Minerva, and then even Charity. So the other daughter is referred to as Aunt Charity if you are reading the whole column. How this can be confused over time, because in this period of time, Black folks were called uncle and aunt as titles. And so this may have contributed to the misunderstanding over time in the relationship between Wallace and Minerva. So with that, why does this matter? And we talked about them being public figures and their musical contribution, but I think there are some deeper lessons that can be learned here. And then also directions for future research and work that can be done. So as I said, when I was, giving everyone the answer at the beginning, knowing their relationship as parent and child helps us move from caricatures that I have seen in the historic record and telling of Wallace and Minerva to persons, and really just honoring the humanity of themselves and the communities that they had come from. So with this work that I've done, I confronted these stereotypes as I was looking through records, and it's something that was very evident, especially looking in certain timeframes, because remember, Wallace and Minerva lived in the antebellum period, and then also, after slavery, when you had like this open romanticism, very vibrant of the slave times and how things were accounted for. And so, for example, there was a 1930s era WPA play, which is in the holdings of OHS. So thank you, OHS, for preserving that history. And it was pretty much a minstrel regarding Wallace and Minerva. They were portrayed as this old slave couple. Wallace was like superstitious and like lazy. And so there's one quote from the play, characterizing him as the laziest old coon in all of the Choctaw Nation. And then even later, in the mid-20th century, there was an oral history account from a descendant of one of Wallace's owners. And, she said this quote, an old-time Southerner will tell you that a well-mated Negro couple has the ability to think as one without any special conscious communication. And so it's like, first of all, it's just wrong because they weren't a couple and she wasn't there, but just like having this kind of memory about them is just very stereotypical, and it's not really like honoring their personhood, especially this idea of, not having conscious communication, like it's just magical that they're just, making up these songs. And then just the paternalism, by saying, well, they're well mated, like they were, put together, because of, unfortunately the conditions and the power dynamics at the time. So, what I'm offering here, I think is a reframing. So really seeing Wallace and Minerva as parent and child and honoring that part of their story and seeing them more as whole persons, we can put things into perspective in a new way. There's an opportunity to do that. And so there are 3 takeaways, I think, for that reframing, to push back against those stereotypes and the caricatures that have been preserved in some of the memory, and to like change how we think about it from this point forward. So first, really thinking about their art and communication and the whole arc of Black music. And then 2, really understanding that they came from a creative community. And then 3, really trying to consider the fatherhood that we can see in their story, because we know that Minerva is the daughter of Wallace Willis. So first, communication. As I was looking into all this information, I made sure I did a read of the history of Black music, because this is a part of that story, Negro spirituals. And Eileen Southern, who did great work on the story of Black music in the so-called United States. One takeaway that she had from one of her books is that the enduring feature of Black music is communication, right? So it's not magical, but it's intentional and it's contextual. And she pointed out that Black musicians have and continue to have much to say to others and to God. And so understanding Minerva and Wallace as actual persons, I think, can give us a better chance to really understand where these people are coming from. And then also seeing the continuity between other art forms, Black music that came after, and then even before, especially with Alex Reed's, claim that Wallace came from South Carolina. And I can talk more about this in the Q&A if people are interested, but it really gives us an opportunity to see the African-centered worldview in all of this, and also other ways of knowing. So secondly, in terms of reframing, or how this new information can reframe how we see Wallace and Minerva, I think it's important to consider not just their creative ability, but how that related to the whole community. And Wallace and Minerva were definitely talented. They were creative folks. So Frances Banks, a descendant of Wallace Willis, she, reminisced in her WPA interview that Wallace was a sweet singer, and he made up songs and sung them. And so it's preserved in the family lineages, such as myself, about, his work. But also he was a leader in the congregation. And so in Alexander Reed's obituary of him, he mentions that Wallace lined out hymns. And so that's a type of a work that someone does in front of the congregation to, say what the line is, and then the congregation repeats that back. So Wallace did that, and he also led prayer in meetings. And so I think this is an invitation for us to ask ourselves, what were these meetings like? What were they doing in them? How did other people participate? Because congregational or worship in a congregation for this community at a time, it was communal. It wasn't like, the superstar worship team that we have now in some cases, where people participate on the sidelines, but no, everyone was participating together. And this is definitely coming through in the story of Steal Away to Jesus, which is a whole nother presentation. But it is also recorded in the work of a great Fisk University professor, John Wesley Warwick II. In one of his books, I want to say it was written like in 1915, but he has an account of how Steal Away to Jesus came about. And everything points to the creative capacity of this community, and Wallace is a part of that. So I think that when we can see them as persons and not like these characters or caricatures, you can dig deeper into these stories that have all these other intriguing lessons. And then third, I would say that it's so important to consider the implications of this for having a more complete understanding or opportunity to see parts of chattel slavery that are maybe underrepresented. And so I know then public discourses about chattel slavery, some folks say, well, we don't know much about fathers or the roles of fathers and all of this. But here for Wallace and Minerva, you have an example of that directly. And I see this as incredibly powerful as well, because they experienced chattel slavery, but also Indian removal in the 1840s. And you still had this bond that was maintained despite all of these things. So you have this warm parental love that's evidenced in the obituary from Alexander. And then also, which I would say is even more profound, is that you have this transfer of knowledge. So you have this intergenerational transfer of skill, potentially, of knowledge and memory, which I think is amazing. And it's something that should be remembered and should be honored. So I think this is an area for future research that I'm excited about and to try to learn more information about. And with that, I have a picture of my genealogy bag here. And I got this when I was undergrad at Howard. And so it has an Akan symbol, but you have like imagery related to lineages. So you have the life cycle. So you have a baby for birth, and then adult faces, and then you have a mask representing the ancestors. So yeah, with that, I thank everyone for listening to me today, and you hearing me talk about my ancestors. So I'm ending with some more photos. I have my birth family on the upper left, so me and my siblings, my mom and dad, hopefully they're all listening. And then on my right, my family now, my husband and my 2 kiddos. And I have another Star Wars picture because I only had one earlier, so I had to have a little bit more of that. Yeah, so thank you. And my live version will be answering your questions. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Great. Thanks, Shelby, for correcting the historic record on these 2 icons in Oklahoma's history. We did have some questions. RH says that this is an excellent description of the detective process. Can you rank the best internet genealogy sites for this research?
Goodness, ranking. I guess, well, I can talk about preferences, but as a general rule of thumb, I would say all of the above. Definitely, take in as much information as you can. But in terms of my work, I use Family Search a lot. I like using it because it's free, and but definitely for researching freedmen families, Fold 3 is really helpful because you have access to the DAWS cards, the application packets. And on a related note, Ancestry, because they also have the DAWS records too, and I can get access to it now through my library. So folks that have your public library card, you can get Ancestry access, Fold 3 access. Yeah, so those are key repositories for this type of research.
Great. Angela asked, the family came out of Holly Springs, Mississippi. Do you know if they were part of the community near the Monroe mission that was in the same area?
So thank you, Miss Angela, for that question. So church records have definitely been integral to my research question. And I did look for some of the folks in the more immediate family with the Monroe mission, but I didn't see folks directly within that Moore cluster. So like John B. Moore and his immediate family. But if I'm remembering correctly, I think I saw some familiar surnames. So it's something that I did look at, and it didn't seem like it provided relevant information at the moment, but it's something that I, have on my back burner. It's there, in my library of information just in case. Yeah.
Great. She also asks, had the surname Burton ever surfaced in the family's oral history?
This is a very interesting, I guess, learning experience for me, and I can share this with others. So for my family, and when I say my family, like my line and what information got to me, no. But on Minerva's DAWS card, so Minerva, so like the Minerva of Aunt Minerva, she was actually enrolled as a Chickasaw freedman. So my direct ancestors were enrolled as Choctaw freedmen. But for her relative, and so it was Wallace and Charlotte. Her parents were down not as Wallace and Charlotte Willis, but Wallace and Charlotte Burton. And so one thing that is important to take note for ancestry of Black folks, so not just within the 5 tribes, but even like in the rest of the so-called United States, surnames matter, but surnames, people go by more than one surname. So if I was like, oh, well, that's not, Willis, I would have missed it. So you really need to keep track of multiple surnames, because depending on the situation, depending on the facts, people have multiple surnames that they go by. So in this case, that's exactly what went down. So in my oral history, what got to me, Burton was not there, but if you were to talk to some of my other cousins, Burton might have been there because it was something that was more known in their line. And then it was on the DAWS card itself.
Great. Nika asked, how were you able to make the connection to the probate in Tennessee? It's often hard for us as freedmen to find our enslavement histories outside of our respective 5 tribes slaveholders.
Yeah, thank you for that, Nika. So she's also one of my genie buddies, and Cherokee, citizen of the Cherokee Nation, also Cherokee freedman. So glad to see you here, Nika. So I guess I can say a few things here. So first of all, I didn't tell the story in a linear fashion. I had to kind of go back and I like arrange my slides like, okay, what would make sense to people? So it's hard for me to remember like what I knew when I knew it. But in terms of that probate, like I knew where they had lived. So I knew that they were in Marshall County. And so I just browsed Marshall County's probate file. I didn't know it was there. And like I said, I used Family Search. So I was on Family Search just flipping through. And that's something that I would encourage any genealogist to do. Like, don't be so like myopic where you're only like looking at your family and certain names, or even just like putting in certain terms in a box on Ancestry. Please browse, because there's a lot of information out there that is not indexed. So it's not going to come up on a search. And you're going to learn so much more context, because you're going to learn like what's possible, because you'll learn more about what types of records are generated. So Nika, honestly, I was working from what I did know, and I was just browsing, and it was one of those moments. And I hear researchers that like they'll be in a library and they'll find the document and they'll like, shout, and they'll like, be really excited. So for me, it was one of those moments at home. I was just flipping through images and I stop and I see a will and I'm like, wait a second, these are my people. And yeah, so that's what I'll say about that. But that's a good question.
Angela asks, what did your family oral history ever say about Minerva as an ancestor?
It's interesting. So again, with those lines, like Minerva was not in my oral history. And so I have a cousin who's probably listening right now, but she mentioned how Charlotte was a name that was in our family generation after generation. And so Charlotte was a name that I was familiar with and a name that I looked for. But this also speaks to another lesson. I think two things. One, it's important to be aware of those naming patterns, because sometimes I think, especially when I was talking to some folks, there was confusion about which person you're talking about. And so in this family, there were multiple Charlottes, there were multiple Charities, there were multiple Minervas. So I had to like flesh all of that. So as genealogists, don't just do like your pedigree where you're only looking at your line, but look at your cluster. So that's like the second thing, because I wouldn't have figured this out if I wouldn't have done like the family group sheets where you look at, the couple and then the children, not just of my direct ancestors, but of their siblings and cousins. Yeah, so I didn't have it in my oral history, but I, had to do the work and flesh it out so I could see the patterns.
She also asked, have you found paper footprints of Wallace and Minerva in church records beyond the Presbyterian denomination? Did they remain in that same denomination after freedom came in 1866 with the treaty?
Yeah, that's a good question. So as far as I know, Wallace stayed, affiliated with that denomination, but Minerva married a man named Charles Anderson. And Charles Anderson was purportedly, I think he was an AME minister. And so I'm started to get into those records to look for him. But yes, in terms of church records, it's important to kind of look across denominations. And then another thing too is that the missionaries worked together. So even like Alexander Reed, he was a Presbyterian, but, and I always mix it up, there's all these letters, but the American Board of Foreign Missions, and there's like a C in there, they weren't just Presbyterians, but there were like other congregationalists in there and everything, but they all worked together. And so I have to untangle that. So it's something that I'm starting to do within the lives of Wallace and Minerva, because Minerva married a man who was a minister in the AME church, but then even with the missionaries, because they worked in a interdenominational environment in their work.
Kelly says, great work on your part, but she asks, some names are so common over the decades. Do you have any tips to narrow down finding a relative with a common name?
Yes, I would say look at best practices, and I wish I had the citation, but there was an article from NGS, so the National Genealogical Society. They have a publication, and there was an article in there, and there was a man who had like an ancestor, and this ancestor had the same name as like there were like 3 or 4 other people that had the same name, and he just had like the methodology. And so I would say like finding articles like that where you have, seen the techniques of what people do. And one thing that he did that I am doing in my write-up, he made like a table where you have like the name and then the parents' names, the birth year, the locations. And that's another thing too. It's not just about names, but it's about the context surrounding them. Because yeah, there might be more than one person named Peggy Smith, but is there another person named Peggy Smith that was born in this place at this time with these siblings, with these parents? You gotta like flesh out that entire, all the information that you can about the person and then compare. And so that was the best practice that helped me out, is like making that table. And I can even like, share that with people later if they're interested. And then also I would say too, is like study that cluster. And so with enslaved persons especially, those first names and then the people around them. And I will say, if you're talking about freedmen of the 5 tribes, you have such a rich data set with the Dawes records because those relationships are captured in the Dawes records. You see the slaveholders, you see siblings, and it's better than a census because with a census, you're looking at one household and it's saying, okay, the relationship between the head of the household with the others in the house. So not even amongst themselves. But with the Dawes records, we get to see so much information that we can make those connections. So definitely, take the time to make those diagrams and make those charts, and that'll help you, really figure out who's who.
Jody asked, can you talk about when the use of the title aunt or uncle would begin in an enslaved person's life? Can that be profiled or generalized?
Oh, goodness, that is an interesting question. Like when it started. I think I would maybe have to defer to somebody that has looked at more information than me on this. But based upon my like research and considering the age of Minerva, this was something that may have been ascribed to her in her 20s. And so I don't know if it would have been, for children. And I think it really is like, from what I have seen, it really varies based upon the individual's relationship to whiteness. And so with other relatives I've seen, a relative that I have by the name of Tal Jones, he was wealthy and he was, prominent in the Black community. He, owned land and oil and so forth. And so in white media, he was referred to as Uncle Tal, right? And so with Wallace and Minerva, I don't know, because of their musical ability, that was also a title that was ascribed to them. And I guess let me make this point too. It's important for us to recognize these things because these titles were, as I said, denoting their relationship to whiteness or to white persons in this power class, but it was not about how they were connected to each other. And I think that's what happened over time. People assume that, this is who they were to each other, but no, these, this was a parent and child, so you have to look at the context that they were in as a community of Black folks, and then their relationship to other, realms as separate inquiries. So I'll leave it at that.
Mark says, I know that many freedmen took on the last name of their owners. Did this cause confusion in your research between the surname Willis versus Williams? And when did Burton come into play?
I don't want to say it caused confusion, but it was just something that I had to keep track of. And so on my research notes, I would write, okay, these are the surnames that I need to keep track of. And earlier in my research, Willis was the surname that I was, looking for all the time. But after I found the obituary, I realized that Burton was. But then also, and I can't remember when it happened, but after I found Minerva's Dawes card with her use of Burton on that Dawes card, so I would just say it's a dynamic process, and just to have an open mind and to take in new information and, compare it with other things that you found. So for me, it wasn't confusing. It was just, more information.
Jennifer wants to know what books you would recommend to learn more about Wallace and Minerva.
Oh, goodness. These are books yet to be written in some ways. And so it's the responsibility of folks that learn new things to write them. But I guess in terms of like related books, like I said, the work of Eileen Southern, and she writes, more broadly. She doesn't mention Wallace and Minerva specifically, but her work on Black music, so you can interpret them in context. And then I would say the books that have been written by folks from the Fisk University community. And these were books that were written over 100 years ago. So they're free online through some of the public domain sources. So the work of John Wesley Works, so he has written 2 books. And in one of them, he has a detailed account of the story of Steal Away to Jesus. And, he mentions the Red River area and how he got this story from a missionary, and everything lines up with, the community of Wallace Willis. So I would recommend those books, and those are available for free.
Larry would like to know, where would you recommend someone start to research their ancestry records?
You definitely start with yourself. So you start with, who you are today as a person, and you work your way back. And that's something that is helpful, because you're working from what you have the most knowledge of, because you're going to get to a point in time where you're dealing with people that don't have anyone alive that knew them directly. And so it's good to start in that way, so you're not jumping into the past and maybe being out of touch with some of those folks. So I can get all these kinds of book recommendations, but you could get a resource like Black Roots by Tony Burrows, or Finding a Place Called Home. Those are good starting points, and they should be available at your local library.
Terry wants to know if you were able to locate Wallace and/or Charlotte as Choctaw freedmen in the 1885 census records.
Oh, in the 1885 census, I found, this is so funny how research, comes together. So if my memory is serving me right, I see Charity in that census. So Charity is the daughter of Wallace and Willis and Minerva, and they're neighbors. So that's another thing about census records, is that you don't know the relationship among neighbors, but then when you find out other ways, you're just like, wow. And so it's like they were like on the same page together this whole time, and I didn't know it. But in terms of the census, Wallace is not there, and I think that makes sense, because he died right before it, and then Charlotte died like 10 years before it. So they died before that census was taken, Terry. So he's also my cousin. So thank you, Terry, for being here.
Well, Shelby, we have time for one more, but there's a lot more questions that people are asking. Do you have an email or some way for these people to ask these questions of you?
This is interesting. As Pope said, I'm co-founder of the Oklahoma Freedmen Collective, so people can email that address to reach me. So that address is hello@okfreedmen.org, and I can even put that in the chat for folks. Let me see.
All right. Well, Mark's going to ask the last question. And he wants to know why Wallace was originally on the Chickasaw Freedmen enrollment card and then transferred to the Choctaw Freedmen card. He was not sure if this opened up more context for your research.
Okay. And I'm not sure if he is referring to, say, like a later ancestor by the name of Wallace, because there's like a Wallace Williams, and I don't remember which group he was enrolled in, or just the person in general. So I'll speak a little bit more broadly. So this is another lesson for 5 tribes genealogy. Please don't just research one tribe, but you have to research multiple ones, especially depending on the family, because there were relationships amongst people that were intertribal. And so especially for Choctaw and or Chickasaw people, because the tribes were so interconnected, and we can talk about that in another discussion. So for me, it was something that I realized later, because I was more narrow, just looking at like Choctaw Freedmen. But the relatives that I had in this cluster, some of them were enumerated as Chickasaw Freedmen. So it was just another lesson learned. And I guess that being said, this is something that takes time. And so this is the culmination of years of research that you're seeing here.
Thank you very much, Shelby. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but we really appreciate your presentation.
Okay, thank you, everyone.